While the soul's ascension cannot be forced or manufactured through technique alone, certain practices can create favorable conditions for this natural process. Jung emphasized that individuation emerges from the dialogue between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, a dialogue that can be facilitated through specific approaches he developed and refined throughout his career. Active imagination. Jung developed this powerful technique as a way to engage directly with unconscious content. Described in detail in The Transcendent Function, 1916/1958, active imagination involves entering a meditative state and allowing images to arise spontaneously, then interacting with them consciously. Unlike passive fantasy or directed visualization, active imagination requires your participation as both observer and participant in an unfolding inner drama. Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz explained, active imagination is a dialogue between ego consciousness and the unconscious personified as an autonomous entity or entities with which a conversation is established. This practice creates a middle ground where conscious and unconscious can meet, fostering integration and transformation. To practice active imagination, begin by quieting the mind through meditation or relaxation techniques. When a spontaneous image, figure, or scene appears, engage with it as you would with an actual person or situation, asking questions, expressing feelings, or simply being present with whatever emerges. Record these encounters through writing, drawing, or movement to anchor them in consciousness. James Hillman, founder of archetypal psychology, suggested approaching these inner figures with an attitude of soul-making, recognizing their autonomy and depth rather than treating them as mere projections of the personal psyche. This attitude of respect toward unconscious content facilitates genuine dialogue rather than ego-driven manipulation. Dream work. Dreams provide direct access to unconscious processes and often contain valuable guidance for individuation. Jung considered dreams the royal road to the unconscious and developed sophisticated approaches to working with them that went beyond symptom-focused interpretation. Keeping a dream journal and reflecting on recurring symbols or themes can strengthen the bridge between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Jung advised approaching dreams with an attitude of curiosity rather than attempting to decode them with rigid interpretations. In The Practical Use of Dream Analysis, 1934, he wrote, "In each soul there is something like a spiritual goal which attracts the energies and shapes them into a meaning which is recognized by consciousness." Jungian #, sign 5. Your relationship with symbols transforms. Mysterious, symbolic music begins. For Jung, symbols were not merely signs or metaphors, but living psychic entities that bridge conscious and unconscious realms. Unlike signs, which stand for something known, symbols point towards something that can never be fully grasped by the rational mind. In his seminal work, Symbols of Transformation, 1912, Jung established the crucial distinction between signs and symbols. A sign is an analogous or abbreviated expression of a known thing, but a symbol is always the best possible expression of a relatively unknown fact, a fact which is nonetheless recognized or postulated as existing. Symbols function as transformers of psychic energy, converting raw, instinctual energies into cultural and spiritual forms. They mediate between opposites, connecting rational consciousness with the irrational depths of the unconscious, the personal with the collective, the temporal with the eternal. In Jung's understanding, authentic symbols are not created but discovered, emerging autonomously from the depths of the psyche with a living, numinous quality that transcends intellectual comprehension. As your soul rises, your relationship with symbols undergoes a significant transformation. This shift is not merely intellectual, but visceral and intuitive. Symbols that once seemed abstract or remote begin to resonate with personal meaning and emotional power. You develop what Jung called symbolic consciousness, the ability to perceive reality not only literally, but symbolically, recognizing the deeper patterns and connections beneath surface appearances. This heightened relationship with symbols often manifests as a newfound fascination with mythology, religious iconography, alchemical imagery, or other symbolic systems. You may find yourself drawn to study ancient wisdom traditions, comparative religion, or depth psychology. These aren't mere intellectual interests, but vital connections to the archetypal dimensions of the psyche. providing frameworks through which your own transformation can be understood and integrated. Jung wrote, "A symbol is the best possible expression for something that cannot be expressed otherwise." This understanding deepens as your soul rises, as you recognize that certain experiences and insights transcend literal language and can only be approached through symbolic expression. The limitations of conventional thought and language become more apparent, while the wisdom embedded in symbolic forms grows increasingly accessible. Thomas, a literature professor, shared his experience. "I had always appreciated mythology academically, but during a profound period of personal transformation following my father's death and my own cancer diagnosis, these ancient stories began to feel intensely relevant to my own life. The hero's journey wasn't just a narrative pattern I taught to students. It was a map of my own psychological process. Reading about Orpheus descending to the underworld to retrieve his beloved resonated with my own journey through grief. The labyrinth at Knossos wasn't just an archaeological curiosity, but a symbol of my own winding path through illness and recovery. Symbols like the labyrinth, the sacred marriage, the divine child, or the wounded healer suddenly appeared everywhere in my dreams and random readings, even in conversations with strangers. It wasn't that I believed these myths literally, but I understood them as expressing psychological truths that transcend time and culture. One night, I dreamed of a golden chalice filled with dark liquid, and upon waking, felt compelled to research this image. I discovered its significance in alchemy as the vessel of transformation, the container in which the prima materia is transformed into the philosopher's stone. This symbol became central to my understanding of my own process, the necessity of containing and transforming suffering rather than avoiding it. This transformed relationship with symbols indicates a growing connection between conscious awareness and the deep archetypal structures of the psyche. Jung identified numerous archetypal symbols that frequently emerge during the individuation process. The mandala, circular forms representing wholeness and integration of the personality. The tree, symbol of growth, connection between realms, and the living process of development. The divine child, representing new possibilities, vulnerable beginnings of transformation. The wounded healer, symbolizing transformation through suffering and the healing power of acknowledged wounds. The alchemical vessel, container for psychological transformation and integration of opposites. The sacred marriage hieros gamos, union of masculine and feminine principles within the psyche. The journey, symbolizing the path of individuation through various trials and transformations. Death and rebirth, representative of psychological transformation and renewal. The shadow, symbolizing the disowned parts of the self that must be integrated. The self, symbols of totality and wholeness, such as the squared circle, quaternity, or divine figures. As you become more attuned to symbolic consciousness, you may notice that certain symbols seem to find you, appearing repeatedly in dreams, synchronistic encounters, creative inspirations, or random discoveries. These number 7 signs your soul is rising. Carl Jung. Introduction. The concept of the soul's ascension is not merely spiritual rhetoric. It represents a profound psychological transformation that Carl Gustav Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, spent his life attempting to understand. Jung believed that beneath our conscious awareness lies a vast inner world, the unconscious, containing not only our personal repressed experiences, but also what he termed the collective unconscious, a repository of universal human experiences encoded in symbolic form. According to Jung, the journey of the soul is not about escaping the physical world, but integrating the disparate parts of our psyche to achieve wholeness, a process he called individuation. When the soul rises, it moves toward this wholeness, gradually bringing unconscious elements into conscious awareness. Today, we explore 7 profound signs that, according to Jungian psychology, indicate your soul is rising, ascending toward greater consciousness, meaning, and authentic selfhood. Sign 1. Meaningful coincidences multiply in your life. Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by conventional causality, but seem to reveal a deeper pattern or purpose. He defined synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle, events linked not by cause and effect, but by meaning. This concept emerged from his extensive work with patients, whose psychological breakthroughs often coincided with unusual external events that seemed meaningfully related to their internal processes. As your soul rises, synchronicities tend to multiply in your life with increasing frequency and significance. You might think of someone moments before they call. You might repeatedly encounter the same symbol, number, or theme across different contexts. A book might fall open to exactly the passage you needed to read. You might meet precisely the person who can help you with a problem just when you need them. These are not mere coincidences, but what Jung called meaningful coincidences. Moments when the external world seems to mirror your internal reality in ways that defy statistical probability and conventional explanation. Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. Carl Jung, in his landmark work Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, 1952, Jung documented numerous cases of such meaningful coincidences. One famous example involved a patient who was describing a dream about a golden scarab beetle when Jung heard a tapping at his window. Opening it, he found a scarabaeid beetle, the closest insect to a scarab found in that region, trying to enter the room. The timing was so extraordinary that it had profound therapeutic implications for the patient, who had been resistant to treatment. These synchronicities often arise during periods of psychological transformation, particularly during what Jung called liminal periods, when the psyche is undergoing significant restructuring. They tend to cluster around major life transitions, psychological breakthroughs, or spiritual awakenings. They serve as guideposts, confirming you're on the right path or directing your attention to something significant you might otherwise overlook. Sarah, a clinical psychologist, shared her experience. During a particularly difficult period in my life, I kept encountering the symbol of the phoenix in artwork and conversation, even in the name of a cafe that opened near my home. This happened so frequently that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. One day, I received a gift from a colleague who had no knowledge of my recent experiences. It was a journal with a phoenix emblazoned on its cover. Later that same day, I turned on the radio to hear a discussion about the myth of the phoenix and its symbolism of regeneration through fire. These encounters felt like a message, reminding me of my capacity for rebirth from the ashes of my old life. Jung believed that synchronicities occur when the archetypal contents of the unconscious are activated and seek expression in conscious life. They represent moments when the division between inner and outer reality temporarily dissolves, revealing the underlying unity of all existence. In his view, these events suggest that psyche and matter may not be fundamentally separate, but different manifestations of a deeper, unified reality. What physicist Wolfgang Pauli, with whom Jung collaborated, called the unus mundus, or one world. The types of synchronicities you experience often reflect the specific archetypal energies being constellated in your psyche. Someone undergoing a profound encounter with their shadow might experience synchronicities involving darkness, hidden spaces, or overlooked objects. Someone engaging with anima/animus energies might encounter synchronistic events involving contrasexual figures or relationship patterns. When you notice such meaningful coincidences multiplying in your life, it may indicate that your soul is rising, becoming more attuned to the subtle connections and patterns that conventional awareness often misses. You may find yourself developing what Jung called the synchronistic attitude, a receptive awareness that allows you to perceive meaningful patterns without forcing them into predetermined frameworks. David Richo, a psychotherapist integrating Jungian perspectives, notes that synchronicities are the universe's way of showing us that we are on the path of heart and purpose. They often provide confirmation when you're aligning with your authentic path, even when that path defies conventional logic or societal expectations. Sign 2. Your dreams become more vivid and meaningful. One of Jung's most profound contributions to psychology was his concept of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we repress, deny, or disown because they contradict our conscious self-image or social expectations. Jung developed this concept gradually throughout his career, with its fullest expression appearing in works like Ion, 1951, and Psychology and Alchemy, 1952. The shadow is not a simple repository of negative traits, but a complex, dynamic aspect of the psyche containing everything that doesn't fit our ego's conception of who we are. Jung wrote, "The shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors. The shadow formed during childhood as we learn which behaviors and qualities are acceptable to our parents, teachers, and broader culture, and which must be hidden to maintain approval and belonging. The shadow isn't inherently negative. It simply contains what we've deemed unacceptable and therefore pushed into unconsciousness. It might include not only our darker impulses like anger, jealousy, or greed, but also positive qualities we've been unable to acknowledge in ourselves. Creativity, sensitivity, power, or brilliance. Jung noted that the shadow often contains our unlived life, potential that remains dormant because it conflicts with our conscious identity or adaptation to social expectations. As your soul rises, encounters with your shadow become more frequent and significant. These encounters can be unsettling because they challenge your established sense of identity. You might find yourself behaving in ways that surprise or disturb you, particularly under stress. You might experience sudden emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to the triggering situation. Dreams featuring disturbing or threatening figures often indicate shadow material-seeking consciousness. Most characteristically, you begin to recognize your projections, those moments when you react with unusual intensity to someone else's behavior because it mirrors something unacknowledged in yourself. These projections often have a visceral quality, an almost electric charge of emotion that signals unconscious material has been activated. As Jung famously observed, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Shadow projection manifests in various ways. The colleague whose laziness infuriates you might be triggering awareness of your own unacknowledged need for rest. The friend whose neediness exhausts you might be reflecting your own disowned vulnerability. The public figure whose arrogance you despise might represent ambitions you've been afraid to acknowledge. Shadow integration involves the courageous act of acknowledging and accepting these disowned aspects of yourself. This doesn't mean acting out every impulse, but rather expanding your self-concept to include a more complete picture of who you are. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." David, a corporate executive, shared his experience. "I used to be irritated by colleagues I perceived as overly emotional or sensitive. I prided myself on being logical and decisive. In meetings, I would inwardly cringe when someone seemed too emotionally affected by criticism or setbacks. During a period of intense self-reflection triggered by a health crisis, I began to notice the vehemence of my reactions to these emotional colleagues. Through therapy and dream work, I realized I was rejecting in others what I refused to see in myself. My own emotional sensitivity had been repressed because it didn't fit my self-image as a strong leader or the expectations placed on me as a man in a competitive corporate environment. The breakthrough came when I had a dream of finding a wounded child locked in the basement of my childhood home. The child was weeping, and I felt both compassion and embarrassment. Upon waking, I understood that this represented my own emotional vulnerability that I had locked away decades ago. Recognizing this was painful but liberating. I didn't become less logical, but I did become more whole. I found that acknowledging my own sensitivity actually made me a more effective leader, more attuned to team dynamics, and more authentic in my interactions. Shadow work often involves confronting difficult emotions like shame, anger, or grief that we've kept at bay. Edward Whitman, a prominent Jungian analyst, noted that the shadow, when it is realized, is the source of renewal. As these emotions are acknowledged and processed, they lose their power to control us from the unconscious. Shadow integration also releases significant energy. The psychic energy previously used to maintain repression becomes available for creative and constructive purposes. Jung believed that much of the shadow's destructive potential comes not from its content, but from its dissociation from consciousness. When shadow elements remain unconscious, they tend to operate autonomously, erupting in ways that can be harmful to ourselves and others. When integrated, these same elements can become valuable allies, providing depth, authenticity, and creative power. The shadow has both personal and collective dimensions. Personal shadow elements develop from individual experiences of shame, trauma, or adaptation. Collective shadow elements derive from cultural taboos, prejudices, and archetypal patterns shared across humanity. During periods of significant transformation, you may encounter not only your personal shadow, but also aspects of the collective shadow. Confronting cultural blind spots or participating in collective shadow awareness. A rising soul naturally moves toward wholeness, which requires embracing all aspects of the self, light and dark, conscious and unconscious. The willingness to face your shadow indicates that your soul is ascending toward greater integration and authenticity. Jung considered shadow work essential not only for individual wholeness, but for humanity's ethical development. How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. Robert Johnson, Jungian analyst and author of Owning Your Own Shadow, suggests 3 steps for shadow integration. Recognizing the shadow through trigger moments, dreams, and patterns in relationships. Honoring the shadow by acknowledging its messages and gifts rather than suppressing it. Integrating the shadow by finding constructive expressions for its energy. As integration progresses, you may notice decreased projection, greater compassion for human failings, both your own and others, more authentic relationships, increased creative energy, and a deeper sense of psychological wholeness that contains multitudes without fragmentation. Sign 4. You encounter the numinous in everyday life. Jung borrowed the term numinous from Rudolf Otto's influential work, The Idea of the Holy, 1917, to describe experiences that evoke a sense of the divine, the mysterious, or the transcendent. Otto characterized the numinous as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a mystery that simultaneously terrifies and fascinates, overwhelming ordinary consciousness with a sense of something wholly other, yet deeply meaningful. Jung expanded this concept, recognizing the numinous as a psychological reality with transformative potential regardless of one's theological positions. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung described his own encounters with the numinous as essential to his psychological development. From the beginning, I had a sense of destiny, as though my life was assigned to me by fate and had to be fulfilled. This gave me an inner certainty. But above all, it confirmed my feeling that I was under the influence of things or questions which were not of my own making or under my control. As your soul rises, you may find yourself more frequently encountering the numinous in everyday life. These experiences aren't limited to formal religious contexts or dramatic mystical visions, but can emerge unexpectedly in ordinary circumstances. Commonplace moments, a sunset casting golden light across a landscape, a child's spontaneous laughter, the pattern of leaves against the sky, the profound silence of early morning, suddenly reveal a depth and significance that transcends their apparent simplicity. These numinous encounters often have several distinctive qualities. A sense of profound meaning that cannot be fully articulated in ordinary language. Altered perception of time. Moments may seem extended or time may appear to stop entirely. Heightened sensory awareness. Colors become more vivid. Sounds more distinct. Textures more palpable. A paradoxical mixture of awe, wonder, and sometimes even fear in the face of something that exceeds ordinary understanding. A sense of being addressed or called forth by something greater than oneself. Dissolution of ordinary boundaries between self and world, subject and object. Lingering transformation. These experiences often continue to work within the psyche long after they occur. Jung wrote about such moments, "The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life." For Jung, these numinous encounters aren't merely subjective experiences, but moments of connection with the objective psyche, the autonomous reality of the unconscious that exists independently of our ego consciousness. These numinous experiences often emerge unexpectedly. They cannot be manufactured or controlled, but arise spontaneously when consciousness is receptive to deeper dimensions of reality. They frequently appear during liminal periods, thresholds of transition when fixed structures of identity are temporarily fluid, allowing greater permeability between conscious and unconscious realms. Elena, an artist, described her experience. "I was walking through a familiar park, a place I'd visited hundreds of times before, when suddenly everything changed. The colors became more vivid, the sounds more distinct. The spring leaves seemed to pulse with life, and I could perceive intricate patterns of relationship between everything around me. I felt a profound sense of connection to everything around me and an overwhelming feeling that reality was infinitely more complex and beautiful than I had realized. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the extraordinary aliveness of what I had previously taken for granted. I stood motionless for what might have been minutes or an hour. Time seemed irrelevant. This wasn't a dramatic mystical vision, but a quiet revelation of the extraordinary within the ordinary. When it passed, I found myself weeping with a mixture of joy and awe. Though the intensity of the moment eventually faded, something fundamental had shifted in my perception that never entirely reverted to its previous state. Jung observed that such numinous encounters often coincide with a constellation of powerful archetypes in the psyche. When archetypal energies, primal patterns of the collective unconscious, become activated during periods of transformation, they can break through into consciousness with numinous quality. These breakthrough moments frequently connect with symbolic material emerging in dreams, creative work, or synchronistic events, forming constellations of meaning that guide the individuation process. Such experiences often defy language and conventional understanding. They point to what Jung called the religious function of the psyche, an innate human tendency to seek meaning beyond the material world. This function operates regardless of whether a person adheres to a particular religious tradition or theological framework. Jung wrote, "Religious experience is absolute. It cannot be disputed. You can only say that you have never had such an experience, whereas your opponent says, 'But I have.' And with this the discussion may end." Importantly, encountering the numinous doesn't necessarily involve supernatural beliefs. It's about perceiving the depth dimension of existence. What poet William Blake meant when he wrote of seeing a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. These are moments when the symbolic and literal dimensions of reality are perceived simultaneously, revealing what James Hillman called the poetic basis of mind, the soul's inherent capacity for metaphorical, multidimensional perception. Jungian analyst Robert Johnson described this capacity as seeing with enchanted eyes, a form of perception that recognizes both the material reality of things and their symbolic significance. This dual vision represents a union of opposites within perception itself, integrating rational observation with intuitive recognition of meaning, scientific understanding with poetic apprehension. When such moments of heightened perception and connection become more frequent in your life, it may indicate that your soul is rising, becoming more attuned to the mysterious depths that underlie ordinary reality. Rather than seeking escape from the everyday world, the rising soul discovers transcendence within immanence, the sacred dimension inherent in ordinary existence. Marion Woodman, Jungian analyst and author, described this recognition. Matter and spirit are not separate. They are different manifestations of the same energy. When we perceive this unity, the world becomes enchanted once again. This re-enchantment of perception represents one of the most significant transformations of the rising soul. The ability to perceive eternity in the temporal, the infinite in the finite, the extraordinary within the ordinary. Sign 5. Your relationship with symbols transforms. For Jung, symbols are not merely signs or metaphors, but living psychic entities that bridge conscious and unconscious realms. Unlike signs, which stand for something known, symbols point towards something that can never be fully grasped by the rational mind. In his seminal work, Symbols of Transformation, 1912, Jung established the crucial distinction between signs and symbols. A sign is an analogous or abbreviated expression of a known thing, but a symbol is always the best possible expression of a relatively unknown fact, a fact which is nonetheless recognized or postulated as existing. Symbols function as transformers of psychic energy, converting raw, instinctual energies into cultural and spiritual forms. They mediate between opposites, connecting rational consciousness with the irrational depths of the unconscious, the personal with the collective, the temporal with the eternal. In Jung's understanding, authentic symbols are not created but discovered, emerging autonomously from the depths of the psyche with a living, numinous quality that transcends intellectual comprehension. As your soul rises, your relationship with symbols undergoes a significant transformation. This shift is not merely intellectual, but visceral and intuitive. Symbols that once seemed abstract or remote begin to resonate with personal meaning and emotional power. You develop what Jung called symbolic consciousness, the ability to perceive reality not only literally but symbolically, recognizing the deeper patterns and connections beneath surface appearances. This heightened relationship with symbols often manifests as a newfound fascination with mythology, religious iconography, alchemical imagery, or other symbolic systems. You may find yourself drawn to study ancient wisdom traditions, comparative religion, or depth psychology. These aren't mere intellectual interests, but vital connections to the archetypal dimensions of the psyche, providing frameworks through which your own transformation can be understood and integrated. Jung wrote, "A symbol is the best possible expression for something that cannot be expressed otherwise." This understanding deepens as your soul rises, as you recognize that certain experiences and insights transcend literal language and can only be approached through symbolic expression. The limitations of conventional thought and language become more apparent, while the wisdom embedded in symbolic forms grows increasingly accessible. Thomas, a literature professor, shared his experience. "I had always appreciated mythology academically, but during a profound period of personal transformation following my father's death and my own cancer diagnosis, these ancient stories began to feel intensely relevant to my own life. The hero's journey wasn't just a narrative pattern I taught to students. It was a map of my own psychological process. Reading about Orpheus descending to the underworld to retrieve his beloved resonated with my own journey through grief. The labyrinth at Knossos wasn't just an archaeological curiosity, but a symbol of my own winding path through illness and recovery. Symbols like the labyrinth, the sacred marriage, the divine child, or the wounded healer suddenly appeared everywhere in my dreams, in random readings, even in conversations with strangers. It wasn't that I believed these myths literally, but I understood them as expressing psychological truths that transcend time and culture. One night, I dreamed of a golden chalice filled with dark liquid, and upon waking, felt compelled to research this image. I discovered its significance in alchemy as the vessel of transformation, the container in which the prima materia is transformed into the philosopher's stone. This symbol became central to my understanding of my own process, the necessity of containing and transforming suffering rather than avoiding it. This transformed relationship with symbols indicates a growing connection between conscious awareness and the deep archetypal structures of the psyche. Jung identified numerous archetypal symbols that frequently emerge during the individuation process. The mandala, circular forms representing wholeness and integration of the personality. The tree, symbol of growth, connection between realms, and the living process of development. The divine child, representing new possibilities, vulnerable beginnings of transformation. The wounded healer, symbolizing transformation through suffering and the healing power of acknowledged wounds. The alchemical vessel, container for psychological transformation and integration of opposites. The sacred marriage, hieros gamos, union of masculine and feminine principles within the psyche. The journey, symbolizing the path of individuation through various trials and transformations. Death and rebirth, representative of psychological transformation and renewal. The shadow, symbolizing the disowned parts of the self that must be integrated. The self, symbols of totality and wholeness such as the squared circle, quaternity, or divine figures. As you become more attuned to symbolic consciousness, you may notice that certain symbols seem to find you, appearing repeatedly in dreams, synchronistic encounters, creative inspirations, or random discoveries. These recurring symbols often point to specific archetypal energies being constellated in your psyche during this phase of development. They serve as guideposts for the journey, highlighting particular aspects of integration that are currently active in your transformation. Professor Joseph Campbell, who expanded on Jung's work with comparative mythology, noted that symbols serve as vehicles of communication between the conscious and the unconscious. As your relationship with symbols deepens, this communication becomes more fluid and reciprocal. The unconscious speaks through symbols, while consciousness develops greater capacity to receive and interpret their messages. This symbolic consciousness represents a crucial aspect of a soul's ascension, the ability to perceive meaning beyond literal, material reality and to engage with the archetypal patterns that shape human experience. It reflects what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to reconcile opposites through symbolic mediation, creating a third position that transcends binary thinking. Edward Edinger, prominent Jungian analyst, described this shift as moving from literalism to symbolism, a fundamental transformation in perception that opens new dimensions of meaning and experience. This doesn't mean abandoning rational thought, but complementing it with symbolic understanding that can contain paradox, ambiguity, and depth. As your soul rises, symbols become not just objects of study, but living presences that guide and inform your journey. You may find yourself spontaneously creating or working with symbols through art, ritual, or imagination, externalizing internal processes in ways that facilitate integration and transformation. This creative engagement with symbols represents what Jung called the way of what is to come, the soul's movement toward greater wholeness through symbolic expression and integration. Sign 6. You experience confrontation with the anima/animus. Among Jung's most profound contributions was his understanding of the contrasexual archetypes within the psyche, the anima, feminine principle in men, and animus, masculine principle in women. These inner figures represent not only biological complementarity, but psychological wholeness. Jung extensively developed these concepts throughout his career, particularly in works like Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, 1934/1954, and Ion, 1951. Jung postulated that these contrasexual archetypes develop from both personal experiences and collective, inherited patterns. The anima in men begins forming through early experiences with female figures, particularly the mother, while absorbing cultural images of femininity from myths, religions, and social contexts. Similarly, the animus in women develops through interactions with male figures and cultural representations of masculinity. However, these archetypes are not merely personal complexes, but autonomous patterns within the collective unconscious that transcend individual experience. Jung believed that each person contains aspects of both masculine and feminine principles regardless of their biological sex or gender identity. In the process of development, however, we typically identify with qualities associated with our biological sex and repress those associated with the opposite sex, creating a one-sided adaptation to cultural expectations. This repression of contrasexual qualities doesn't eliminate them, but pushes them into the unconscious, where they organize into a semi-autonomous complex that influences our behavior, relationships, and perceptions. As your soul rises, you may experience a significant confrontation with your anima or animus. This confrontation represents a pivotal phase in individuation, the process through which the personality achieves greater wholeness through integration of previously unconscious elements. For men, this often involves recognizing and integrating qualities traditionally labeled feminine: receptivity, emotional sensitivity, intuition, relatedness, diffuse awareness, and nurturing capacity. For women, it may involve integrating traditionally masculine qualities: assertiveness, logical analysis, independence, focused action, abstract thinking, and directive energy. This confrontation rarely feels comfortable at first. Jung noted that the initial encounter with the anima or animus often has a powerful numinous quality that can be both attractive and disturbing. The contrasexual archetype frequently appears first in dreams, fantasies, or projections onto others. A man might find himself inexplicably attracted to or repelled by a woman who embodies qualities of his own unacknowledged anima. A woman might experience similar reactions to men who represent aspects of her animus. Jung distinguished 4 developmental stages of the anima and animus that roughly correspond to levels of psychological integration. For the anima in men, Eve, the biological instinctual feminine associated with the mother and basic survival needs. Helen, the romantic aesthetic feminine associated with beauty and idealized relationships. Mary, the spiritual devotional feminine associated with compassion and deeper emotional connection. Sophia, the wisdom figure representing integration and transformative insight. For the animus in women, the physical man, associated with raw power and strength. The romantic man, the man of action and achievement. The word, the bearer of meaning and understanding. The spiritual guide, the mediator of wisdom and transcendent meaning. Jung wrote, "The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. The shadow is a tight passage and narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. But one must learn to know oneself in order to know who one is." James, a physician, described his experience. "I had always valued rationality and objectivity in my work and life. Emotion seemed messy and unreliable, something to be controlled rather than expressed. During a period of profound change triggered by burnout and a marriage crisis, I began having dreams of a mysterious woman who seemed to embody everything I'd rejected: intuition, emotional depth, artistic sensitivity, relational wisdom. In one particularly powerful dream, this woman led me through a hospital I didn't recognize, showing me patients I had supposedly treated but couldn't remember. Each patient had been healed not through medical intervention, but through some form of compassionate presence I couldn't comprehend. The woman told me, 'You heal with your hands, but you don't know how to heal with your heart.' These dreams were disturbing but compelling, often leaving me in tears upon waking, an experience entirely foreign to my waking personality. I began journaling these dreams and eventually sought therapy with a Jungian analyst. Gradually, I realized this dream figure represented my anima, aspects of myself I denied throughout my life and medical career. As I made space for these qualities, allowing myself to acknowledge emotions, developing my intuitive capacities, exploring creative pursuits I'd abandoned, my relationships deepened, and I became a more effective, empathetic physician. Patients responded differently to me, often commenting on qualities I previously lacked. My marriage, once on the brink of collapse, began to transform as I brought more emotional presence to our relationship. Jung emphasized that genuine confrontation with the anima or animus often requires moving beyond cultural stereotypes to engage with these archetypes as autonomous psychological realities. Initial encounters frequently manifest through projections onto actual people, but mature integration involves withdrawing those projections and recognizing these qualities within oneself. This integration is often facilitated through creative expression, dream work, active imagination, or authentic relationship, processes that allow unconscious content to become conscious in a contained way. As integration progresses, the formerly contrasexual qualities become accessible resources rather than autonomous complexes operating outside conscious control. Integration of the anima or animus doesn't mean abandoning qualities associated with one's biological sex, but expanding one's psychological repertoire to include a fuller range of human capacities. This integration is essential for achieving what Jung called the coniunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites that characterizes psychological wholeness. Emma Jung, Carl's wife and a significant analyst in her own right, noted that integration of the animus for women involves developing independent thinking, creative action, and spiritual autonomy without sacrificing relatedness and emotional depth. Similarly, anima integration for men involves developing emotional intelligence, intuitive wisdom, and relational capacity without sacrificing rational thought and focused action. When you find yourself confronting and integrating these contrasexual aspects of your psyche, it indicates that your soul is rising toward greater completeness and internal harmony. This process often coincides with shifts in external relationships as well, moving from projection-based attractions toward more authentic connections with others who are seen more clearly as themselves rather than as carriers of your projected unconscious content. Sign 7. You experience a deepening connection to the self. At the center of Jung's understanding of the psyche lies what he called the self, the organizing, regulating center of the total personality, including both conscious and unconscious aspects. The self is distinct from the ego, our conscious identity, and represents the archetype of wholeness and integration. In Jung's words, the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. Jung developed this concept gradually throughout his career, with its fullest expression appearing in works like Ion, 1951, and Mysterium Coniunctionis, 1955-56. He drew from diverse cultural traditions to articulate this central archetype, finding parallels in the Hindu concept of Atman, Buddhist understandings of Buddha nature, Christian notions of the Christ within, and alchemical symbols of the philosopher's stone or lapis philosophorum. The self manifests in dreams, visions, and creative expressions through specific archetypal imagery, often appearing as symbols of wholeness, totality, or transcendent order. Common self-symbols include mandalas, circular forms with organized, often symmetrical patterns around a center. Quaternity patterns, fourfold structures representing completeness and orientation. Divine or royal figures, kings, queens, wise elders, or divine beings representing spiritual authority. The divine child, representing new wholeness emerging from the union of opposites. Geometric forms of completeness, the squared circle, perfect spheres, or crystals. The world tree or axis mundi, connecting different levels of being around a central axis. Sacred buildings, temples, churches, or palaces that organize space around a sacred center. As your soul rises, you experience a deepening connection to this self. This often manifests as a sense of being guided by something larger than your ego, a wisdom that transcends your limited personal perspective. This connection doesn't emerge suddenly but develops gradually through the ongoing process of individuation, becoming increasingly perceptible as psychological integration progresses. Jung wrote in 2 essays on analytical psychology, individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. This connection to the self doesn't nullify individual identity, but contextualizes it within a larger whole. The ego remains important as the center of consciousness and executor of the personality, but it no longer claims to be the entirety of who you are. Instead, it assumes a more appropriate role as a satellite orbiting the true center of the personality, the self. Signs of this deepening connection often include a growing sense of purpose that transcends personal ambition or social expectations, increased capacity for compassion beyond your immediate circle or self-interest, greater acceptance of life's paradoxes and contradictions without needing to resolve them intellectually, a sense of participating in something larger than yourself that gives meaning to both joy and suffering, diminished fear of death as part of life's natural cycle rather than absolute termination, more frequent experiences of meaningful coincidences or synchronicities, reduced attachment to fixed outcomes while maintaining committed action, increasing ability to hold opposing perspectives or feelings simultaneously, a natural gravitation toward authenticity rather than persona-driven behaviors, periodic experiences of unusual clarity or insight that seem to come from beyond the ego. Rebecca, a social worker, described her experience. Throughout my early career, I was driven by a need to prove myself and succeed according to external standards. I worked exhaustively, measuring my worth through achievements and recognition. During a profound life transition precipitated by a health crisis that forced me to stop working temporarily, something fundamental shifted. In the extended silence of recovery, I began to sense a deeper purpose in my work, not based on achievement, but on authentic service. A pivotal moment came during meditation when I experienced what I can only describe as a profound recognition of an internal center that felt simultaneously deeply personal and vastly beyond my individual self. In the months that followed, decisions that once seemed complicated became clearer, guided by an inner compass I couldn't quite explain, but deeply trusted. I found myself naturally setting boundaries that previously seemed impossible, pursuing projects that resonated with this deeper sense of purpose rather than external recognition, and relating to clients with greater presence and compassion. This wasn't about abandoning responsibility or becoming passive, but finding my unique place in a larger pattern. The ego-driven questions that once consumed me. Am I successful enough? Am I making the right impression? Gradually gave way to deeper questions. What service am I uniquely positioned to offer? What is trying to emerge through my work? This shift didn't eliminate difficulties, but provided a meaningful context for them that made them bearable, even valuable. Jung believed that the ultimate aim of psychological development is a proper relationship between the ego and the self, where the ego acknowledges the self as the true center of the personality and aligns with its guidance. This relationship doesn't remove life's difficulties, but provides a meaningful context for them. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung wrote, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. This defeat isn't destruction, but right-sizing. The ego recognizing its proper role within the larger personality." Jungian analyst Edward Edinger called this process ego-self-axis formation, the establishment of a viable connection between conscious identity and the deeper organizing center of the psyche. This connection becomes a channel through which unconscious content can enter consciousness in an integrated way rather than through overwhelming or dissociative experiences. The self-connection manifests differently across individuals and life stages, reflecting the unique psychological makeup and circumstances of each person. For some, it emerges through creative expression, for others through relationship or service, and for others through intellectual or spiritual pursuits. What unites these diverse expressions is an increasing sense of alignment with one's authentic nature and deeper purpose. This connection doesn't imply moral perfection or freedom from psychological struggles, but rather a different relationship to those struggles, one characterized by greater perspective, compassion, and meaning. Jung emphasized that wholeness differs from perfection. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. When you experience this deepening connection to the self, it indicates that your soul is rising toward what Jung considered the highest aim of human development, becoming who you truly are in the deepest sense. This represents not an escape from the human condition, but a more complete embodiment of it, embracing both its limitations and its profound possibilities. Integration, the soul's journey toward wholeness. These 7 signs, synchronicities, vivid dreams, shadow integration, numinous encounters, symbolic awareness, anima/animus integration, and connection to the self, do not occur in a linear progression, but often overlap and interweave throughout the journey of individuation. They represent different facets of a unified process unfolding through time, with each aspect supporting and reinforcing the others in a complex psychological ecology. Jung emphasized that individuation, the process by which the soul rises toward wholeness, is not about achieving perfection but integration. In Psychological Types, 1921, he wrote, "Individuation is a natural necessity by which the human being develops into what he was from the beginning. This process isn't about becoming something other than yourself, but rather uncovering and embodying your authentic nature more fully. Individuation involves developing a more fluid relationship between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, allowing greater access to the wisdom and energy of the total personality. This doesn't mean conscious control of the unconscious, which Jung considered impossible and potentially dangerous, but rather establishing a receptive, dialogical relationship between different aspects of the psyche. This journey is rarely smooth or comfortable. As Jung observed, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Periods of confusion, darkness, and disorientation often precede breakthroughs in awareness. What Jung called the night sea journey, or the dark night of the soul, frequently precedes rebirth at a higher level of consciousness. These difficult passages aren't failures or detours, but essential aspects of the transformative process. The rising soul doesn't escape human limitation, but embraces it with greater compassion and understanding. As Jung wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." This integration creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing elements in creative tension rather than identifying exclusively with one side of any polarity. In practical terms, this integration might manifest as greater tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty without needing premature closure, reduced need to control outcomes while maintaining purposeful direction, increased capacity to hold opposing perspectives without fragmentation or confusion, more authentic expression of your unique gifts without persona-driven distortion, deeper connection to others while maintaining healthy boundaries, a sense of participating in life's unfolding rather than forcing it according to rigid plans, balance between conscious direction and receptivity to the unconscious, integration of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition as complementary modes of perception, harmony between spiritual awareness and embodied presence in the material world, reconciliation of individual uniqueness with participation in human community. Dr. Robert Johnson, a Jungian analyst, beautifully described this integration. Wholeness is not a state of perfection. It's a state of embracing the light and the dark, the painful and the joyful, not holding anything out of the picture for the sake of a manufactured peace. This integration doesn't eliminate life's difficulties, but changes your relationship to them. Suffering remains part of human experience, but it becomes contextualized within a larger pattern of meaning and growth. Jung noted, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. The rising soul develops capacity to bear necessary suffering with consciousness rather than avoiding it through various forms of dissociation." Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators, observed that individuation involves not only psychological integration but ethical development, moving from conventional morality toward what she called objective ethics. This involves increasingly sensitive attunement to the unique requirements of each situation rather than rigid adherence to abstract principles or collective norms. The individuation process continues throughout life, with different aspects becoming prominent at different stages. Jung observed that the first half of life typically emphasizes development of ego strength, adaptation to collective expectations, and establishment of identity within the social world. The second half, ideally, shifts toward deeper questions of meaning, purpose, and spiritual development. However, these phases aren't strictly chronological. Some individuals encounter deep psychological and spiritual questions early in life, while others may focus on external adaptation well into their later years. Whatever its timing, the soul's rising represents a fundamental shift from externally determined identity toward authentic selfhood guided by the wisdom of a total personality. This doesn't mean abandoning social responsibility, but grounding it in deeper authenticity. As Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Practical approaches to support the soul's rising. While the soul's ascension cannot be forced or manufactured, certain practices can create favorable conditions for this natural process. Active imagination. Jung developed this technique as a way to engage directly with unconscious content. It involves entering a meditative state and allowing images to arise spontaneously, then interacting with them consciously. Unlike passive fantasy, active imagination requires your participation as both observer and participant. Dream work. Keeping a dream journal and reflecting on recurring symbols or themes can strengthen the bridge between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Jung advised approaching dreams with an attitude of curiosity rather than attempting to decode them with rigid interpretations. Creative expression. Artistic practices, whether visual arts, writing, music, or movement, can provide channels for unconscious material to enter consciousness. Jung himself engaged in what he called soul work through his creation of mandalas and the images in his Red Book. Shadow work. Deliberately exploring disowned aspects of yourself through journaling, therapy, or mindful self-observation can accelerate the process of psychological integration. This might involve asking, what qualities do I most strongly judge in others? Or what parts of myself do I hide from the world? Symbolic living. Approaching life experiences symbolically rather than literally can open new dimensions of meaning. This might involve asking of difficult experiences. What is this asking me to learn or develop? What myth or story does this echo? Community and relationship. Jung emphasized that individuation doesn't mean isolation. Authentic relationships provide mirrors that reflect both our conscious self-image and unconscious projections, offering opportunities for greater self-awareness. Nature connection. Spending time in natural settings often facilitates connection with deeper aspects of the psyche. The patterns and cycles of nature reflect and evoke archetypal patterns within the human soul. Challenges of the rising soul. As your soul rises, you may encounter certain challenges that are natural aspects of this process. Cultural disconnection. Greater awareness can sometimes create a sense of alienation from prevailing cultural values and norms. Finding like-minded community becomes important during these times. The inflation risk. Profound spiritual or psychological experiences can sometimes lead to what Jung called inflation, an over-identification with archetypal forces that loses sight of human limitation. Maintaining humility and groundedness is essential. Integration difficulties. As previously unconscious material enters awareness, you may temporarily experience greater internal conflict or emotional turbulence. This is a natural part of the integration process, not a sign of regression. Relationship changes. As you change, your relationships naturally shift as well. Some connections may deepen while others may need to be released or renegotiated. This can be painful, but ultimately serves authentic connection. The balance challenge. Maintaining balance between ordinary responsibilities and the soul's deeper journey can be difficult. Jung emphasized the importance of living fully in both dimensions, the mundane and the transcendent. Jung reminds us, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The challenges of the soul's journey are not obstacles, but integral aspects of the process itself. Conclusion. The continuing journey. The 7 signs we've explored, synchronicities, vivid dreams, shadow integration, numinous encounter, symbolic awareness, anima/animus integration, and connection to the self, are not destinations, but waypoints on the continuing journey of the soul. Jung believed that individuation is never complete in a single lifetime. The soul's rising is not a linear ascent, but a spiral path that revisits similar themes at progressively deeper levels of understanding and integration. As your soul rises, the ultimate transformation may not be dramatic external change, but a profound shift in how you experience and engage with life. Ordinary moments become infused with extraordinary meaning. Suffering, while not eliminated, becomes contextualized within a larger pattern of growth and development. In Jung's words, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This becoming is the essence of the soul's rising, not an escape from human limitation, but a deeper embrace of the full spectrum of human experience, illuminated by connection to the archetypal dimensions that give our lives meaning and purpose. The signs we've explored are not meant as measures of spiritual achievement, but as guideposts that help us recognize and honor the soul's natural movement toward wholeness. They remind us that beneath the surface of ordinary life runs a powerful current of meaning and transformation, available whenever we have the courage to dive deeper into the mystery of our own being. References and further exploration. For those wishing to explore these concepts further, the following works by Carl Jung and Jungian scholars provide valuable insights. Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz. The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Jung. The Portable Jung edited by Joseph Campbell. Inner Work by Robert Johnson. The Middle Passage by James Hollis. The Eden Project by James Hollis. The Soul's Code by James Hillman. Care of the Soul by Thomas More. Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung, Autobiography. Additionally, working with a Jungian analyst or therapist can provide personalized guidance for those seeking to deepen their understanding of these psychological and spiritual processes. Remember that the soul's journey is uniquely yours. While these signs provide a framework for understanding, your own experience will have its particular texture and rhythm. Trust the wisdom that emerges from within as you continue this most important of all human journeys, the journey toward wholeness. About the author. This script was created to explore Jungian concepts related to spiritual and psychological growth. It draws primarily on the works of Carl Gustav Jung, 1875 to 1961, the Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology, and various Jungian scholars who have developed his ideas. Jung's contributions to psychology include concepts such as the collective unconscious, archetypes, synchronicity, and psychological types. His approach emphasized the importance of integrating unconscious content into conscious awareness to achieve psychological wholeness, a process he called individuation. While Jung was a scientist and psychiatrist, his work also engaged deeply with spiritual, religious, and mystical traditions from around the world. He saw psychological and spiritual development as interconnected aspects of the same fundamental process of becoming more fully human. The framework presented in this script is an interpretation of Jungian principles applied to the concept of spiritual growth or the rising of the soul. It is offered as a perspective that many have found meaningful and illuminating on their own journeys of self-discovery.